if you've been feeling a lot of big emotions and maybe the pull towards changing your habits, changing your health practices, maybe even like completely overhauling your life and what that looks like in the day-to-day and your overall trajectory of your life, maybe a lot of like childhood trauma, generational healing type stuff has been coming up. First of all, you're not alone. That is a big undercurrent of the current astrology. And of course, we're here to figure out why. Second of all, this eclipse season, which we're here to cover on this episode, is bringing that kind of stuff up in a big way. These big emotions and really how we deal with them in an embodied sense is coming up in a big way for a lot of reasons that I will thoroughly cover on this podcast episode. Not only cover why it's coming up astrologically, but also what it might look like in your life, how to recognize it, and then, of course, what to do about it with your yoga practices and journal prompts. That is what a Yogiscope is. First, I'd like to extend you a warm welcome to the Yogiscopes podcast. I'm your host, Rosemary Holbrook. I am a Vedic sidereal astrologer and a yoga therapist, which means I take not just any old astrology, like if you're out there on the internet, if you're new to astrology and you've never heard of the different kinds, maybe it just before this moment was all just astrology to you. Vedic astrology pairs really well with yoga. I'll just leave it at that for now because it comes from the same philosophy where yoga, Ayurveda, all of that, Jyotish, Vedic astrology, comes from the same ancient texts, the Vedas. So there's that. And then I use the yoga therapy training that I have, yoga therapy skills and training that I've spent many years learning and practicing to help you embody the energy, to help you do something about it. Because I recognize that astrology can sometimes be a little bit heady, a little bit cerebral. What I sometimes call it is a little bit upper chakra imbalanced, where we're kind of up here in the spirit realm. And that's great. I'm glad that we can be in touch with that sort of spirit realm type stuff, but we want to bring it down to earth, bring it down to embodied reality. And so that's also, what we're here to do in general on this podcast. So welcome back if you're a returning listener. I'm grateful to have you here either way. But then at this eclipse season in particular, the themes of sort of grounding into reality and embodying the spirituality so that you don't get kind of lost in delusion or overthinking in your subconscious and not really like taking action in an aligned way. That's coming up in a big way at this eclipse season. So we're going to cover it from all angles, and I'm going to tell you all the reasons, all the various ways that that's coming up. So just briefly, I'll give you a rundown about what eclipse season is, and then we'll dive into all of the other sort of concurrent astrological happenings, because that's the thing. I have a really hard time talking about any one thing at once. There's a little bit of like neurodivergence happening there, like everything's happening all the time and all these conversations are happening in my brain, right? But also, that's all these other happenings. Some of the ones that we'll cover are how Jupiter retrograde and Uranus retrograde and a bunch of sacred periods, festivals in the Hindu or Indian traditions, such as Ancestor, Fortnight, things like that, we'll cover on this episode. So if that just sounded like a bunch of gibberish to you, don't worry, it'll get more clear as we continue to explore it throughout the episode. But also, those things are what makes this eclipse season different than the last eclipse season or the next eclipse season, because there are different other things going on, and that's what we're here to explore and to make meaning of and to learn how to put it into practice in our lives. So, with that, let's just first think about what an eclipse season is in general. So, they happen about twice a year. Well, they happen twice a year, and eclipses happen. So they always come in pairs. We always have a solar eclipse with a lunar eclipse. And I just would love to nerd out about the astronomy of this for a minute. And if you want to go even deeper, You can search wherever you're getting this podcast episode, except I think this one's not on YouTube. But if you're listening on a podcast platform like Apple or Spotify, you search on this podcast, on the Yogiscopes podcast, the Karmic indicators. I did a whole episode about Rahu and Ketu and the astronomy, mythology, the Vedic myths behind how we understand them. And that's always great to revisit at eclipse season, because Rahu and Ketu, as they're known in Western astrology, the nodes of the moon, are responsible for eclipses. And so mathematically, or they're not planets. We treat them as planets, as bodies moving through space. But they're mathematical points. And so it really helps to understand what we're talking about with anything astrologically, to understand what eclipses are, like what's happening, and that will help understand the meaning. So that's why I'm going to tell you about this. So anything astrologically, when we say a planet is in a sign, like for example, maybe you know your birthday. So you know, like for example, my birthday is February 11th. So that makes me, in Western astrology, an Aquarius sun. So that's like saying my sun in Western astrology is in the tropical zodiac is in Aquarius. And so when we're saying the sun is in Aquarius, or these eclipses are in Pisces and Virgo, we don't mean that the sun is physically in that constellation of stars. We mean, from our point of view on Earth, the constellations are moving around this circle. You could picture it as like our picture view around where we're standing on Earth. And so the degrees that we're talking about are like away from that point, right? From where we're looking up at it. And so the rising sign, which we'll explore later on, is whatever's rising on the eastern horizon at any given moment. So it becomes really important at the time of your birth. So anyway, the constellations are moving around from our perspective, and so are the planets. And so you can think of the stars, the constellations, as like the backdrop, and the planets are moving across the sky as well. But here's what's happening though. They're not all moving on the exact same line. So the majority of them move across what we call the ecliptic. But the sun and the moon, they actually are moving on different lines. And so when those lines intersect, the sun and the moon overlap. Otherwise, they'll be a little bit, if you were to look up in the night sky, one will be like below or above the other. But the moments when those lines intersect, that's when we have an eclipse. When the sun either, the earth will come between the sun and the moon at a full moon. And so the earth's shadow is casting on the moon, which makes it a lunar eclipse. And then when the moon comes between the earth and the sun at a new moon, and they're right there with each other, the moon blocks out the sun, and that is a solar eclipse. And so what's happening when that happens is, before we had all this astronomy to really know what was happening in the ancient cultures, they were making all this meaning about it. And you can go back and listen to the Rahu and Ketu, the Karmic indicators episode I was talking about. If you want to dive deeper there, it's always good to revisit around eclipses. But basically, they impact us deeply. If you've ever been to a solar eclipse, like seen a total solar eclipse, and so being in the zone of totality is much different than being in like even 99% totality, because when it gets completely dark, even the animals, like the birds will go to roost, the crickets will start chirping in the middle of the day, the animals think it's night. And so something similar happens with us, where it's just this like weird, eerie vibe eclipses have. And I noticed this too, that the time around the eclipses, it's almost like there's weird shadows being casted like during the day, and I think this is just my theory, is that's related to the moon coming closer to the sun and maybe just distorting the light a little bit. And so Rahu and Ketu, the nodes of the moon, are those mathematical points that are responsible for eclipses. And so because of that, because of the way that, circles around Earth go, if a circle intersects with another circle, and they have like the same center point, which is the center of Earth, it's going to intersect twice. So that's why we always have 2 eclipses, and they happen twice a year. And so that's the astronomy of it. The astrology of it is if you think about what the sun and the moon represent. And then, of course, we'll also talk about what Rahu and Ketu represent, because those are the planets, the archetypes that are involved in eclipses. The moon is our emotions, our intuition, right? Our sense of nurturing. And the sun is our soul, and maybe also how we shine in the world, like what we sort of shine out, or how we're meant to shine in the world. So when they are getting shadows casted over them, it gets to be a time where our intuition might be a little bit shadowy. Like, I'm not going to say your intuition is wrong, but it might be like harder to tap into. It might be that you're having these like downloads, right? Where your intuition might actually be more powerful, but it's kind of unclear how you should work with it, if that makes sense, during these eclipse times. And so then with the sun, it's like you might also not be putting yourself out there in the most clear way. So those are the reasons why you'll most often hear astrologers say around the time of eclipses, it's a time to lay low and do your spiritual practices and not really start new things. And so we'll explore that. I always say take it with a grain of salt. Sometimes things will powerfully set in motion that you've been working on for a long time. And during the eclipse season, we call it like this portal, where it's like whatever you're kind of working on during this eclipse portal will sort of reverberate beyond. And you're either ingraining old patterns or forming new patterns that will reverberate beyond the eclipse season. So they happen twice a year, so they happen about every 6 months, right? And so when we say this portal or the eclipse season, what we're talking about is it's a 6-week time period that happens every 6 months, so twice a year, right? And so the 6 weeks are marked by the eclipses. Since one happens at a new moon and one happens at a full moon, that's like half a lunar cycle, right? A fortnight. There's 2 weeks between one eclipse to the next, because that just has to do with the way the Earth and the moon and the sun move around Earth. And so they always happen like that. And so we consider astrologically the eclipse season portal to be the time from the new moon before, or, whichever is happening first, from the moon cycle before, the fortnight before, the fortnight between, and which in Vedic astrology we call pakshas. That just means fortnight, or the 2-week period in between, and then the 2-week period until the next regular lunar phase, like new or full moon phase after the second eclipse. And so this year, that eclipse portal is happening from the new moon in Leo on Monday, September 2nd, and then the peak will be between the full moon lunar eclipse in Pisces on September 17th through the new moon solar eclipse in Virgo on October 2nd, and then it will officially end on October 17th with the full moon in Aries. So don't worry if that didn't just sink in. I will, of course, do individual episodes for each of those 4 things, for the new moon in Leo on September 2nd, the lunar eclipse in Pisces, the solar eclipse in Virgo, and the full moon in Aries. Of course, we will dive into those individually as it gets closer to when they're happening. But this episode is to just serve as a zoom out of like, how can you make the most of this time while we're not in it yet, while your intuition is not being blurred out or blotted out or having a shadow cast upon it just yet. So we want to kind of zoom out and look at the whole period and what all is happening beforehand, so that you can maybe step through it with some intention and grace. And then we'll dive more into the particulars as we go, as always. So with that, we've covered what eclipse season is, right? It's the 6-week period this year between September 2nd and October 17th is our eclipse portal. And it's between those dates that your intuition might start getting kind of blurred out for the reasons I said. And so Rahu and Ketu, let's just briefly dive into those, which always with a caveat to like, please revisit the resources that I will link in the blog post that I make about this episode. I've started doing this where I make a more in-depth, it used to be for the membership only, and now I've made it so that the sign by sign is still for folks that join the brand new iteration of the Vedic Astrology Club. And so you can get the sign by sign actually for the eclipse. For longer term things like this, I publish them to everybody. For the individual like new moons and full moons, it's members only. And so anyway, I've started publishing that for everybody so that you can have this place to go revisit. So it's like handy to listen to the podcast episode. You might be driving or walking or doing chores right now while you're listening. And so having that companion blog post can help you kind of refresh your memory about the things that you heard me say. And for the folks who maybe aren't auditory listeners, or auditory learners, I mean. So anyway, I will put all these dates in there of like, and these past resources like that Karmic Indicators episode I was talking about. There's a whole bunch of resources from this time last year when Rahu and Ketu moved into the signs that they're in. And so you can revisit all of those individual resources. I'll link them in the companion blog post at your convenience, but just a quick synopsis now to give it context. Rahu is the north node of the moon. If you've heard that in like Western astrology before, Rahu and Ketu are the nodes of the moon, Rahu being the north, Ketu being the south node. And the mythology goes that basically they were one snake that got severed at the neck. And so you can go listen to that past episode to hear the whole story. But Rahu is the head of a snake without a body. Ketu is the body of a snake without a head. And so with that, we get the archetype that Rahu is this sort of all-consuming, like maybe even sort of overstimulating, because your head is where you take in all of your sensory input, right? Your head is also where we make stories about that sensory input. So in the brain, right? Our brain is always just sort of interpreting things for us. The things that we take in with our eyes, our ears, our mouth, right? Our smell. And so when that gets disconnected from the body, what we have is this lack of digestion, this lack of, paring things down to what's essential, like the nutrients, right? And then the body without a head, we get this more like embodied feeling rather than thinking energy, but maybe also like a lack of interpretation, a lack of higher thinking sort of thing going on with the body without the head. And also this is where we get that Ketu is sort of disconnecting from things like worldly pleasures because it's disconnected from all those sensory environments of the head, or like the desires of the brain and the head to kind of participate in the world, right? So the body without a head is more of a, you can think of it like spiritual vagrant kind of vibe. That's Ketu. And so those are the archetypes. Rahu, the north node, being things like obsession, worldly sort of pleasures, being like overstimulated, these kind of things, overthinking maybe even, and not digesting. Whereas Ketu is the more embodied, but maybe more detached, like not caring, not paying attention sort of vibe. And at the time of these eclipses, the eclipses will be occurring, as I mentioned, in Pisces and Virgo. So we'll dive more into the individual eclipses, of course, as we go. But with Rahu in Pisces, the vibe, and you can also revisit the whole episode I did last fall, about a year ago, when they moved there, about these archetypes. And there's also a companion blog post. When you go to yogiscopes.com and click on articles, there's a drop down, you click on weekly Yogiscopes, you can find last year's eclipse season 1 there. And so that'll take you into all of those resources in that podcast episode and all of that. But anyway, in short, Rahu in Pisces is creating this big desire, right? Rahu, this maybe insatiable desire, because there's no connection to the hunger and fullness cues of the body. This insatiable desire to do Pisces things. And Pisces things are like tapping into the subconscious, going on retreat, spiritual travel, paying attention to the emotions, which can lead to, maybe on the shadow side, this sort of overthinking or letting your emotions take too much of like the driver's seat, or maybe even, we might say, delusion, right? And then Ketu, being the more embodied, more detached one in Virgo, is creating this. So Virgo is related to health and routines, and it's funny, a Virgo rising said to me the other day that health was their number one value. And I was like, that's like the most Virgo thing I've heard all day, when that person said that to me. And so Virgo is all about health and wellness and routines that get you there. And when Ketu is there, what we know about Ketu is sometimes Ketu can kind of cut you away from those things. It can make you have a spiritual experience around what being detached from maybe health and wellness is, from those things. And so basically, the overall vibe of this eclipse season is sort of balancing that embodiment of wellness with, there's some element of psychosomatic, right? So with Pisces being the emotions and the subconscious, and Virgo being the body and your everyday habits and your physical health, right? There is this element of maybe kind of getting to the root and figuring out what the trauma, the subconscious trauma that's like carrying on in your body, those kind of things. And working through the emotions that might be keeping you from habits of wellness and all of that kind of stuff. So we'll dive more deeply into it as we go. But that's the vibe, is like, how can you sort of, like I said in the beginning of the episode, sort of break free from these old patterns, maybe habits, daily habits around your like health routines and stuff. Like, what are your daily habits making you more healthy or less healthy? And is there an emotional component, like maybe like emotional eating, or some like depression coming up that's keeping you from doing a lot of healthy habits, right? So real life stuff. What's coming up along that axis for you between, like psychosomatic symptoms and how trauma might be manifesting in the body. And so we'll continue to explore it as we go. There's a couple other things that I want to talk about happening around this eclipse season that I think make it just more supportive of transformation. And so, especially if you're here listening to this podcast, means you're paying attention, and it means you're more likely to harness these energies that are present in a way that will be supportive of stepping through the portal in a way that doesn't just reinforce old patterns that weren't working for you. Stepping through this eclipse portal in a way that brings you closer to your goals, or to the person you want to be, or to the life you want to live. And so this is why it's good to think about this beforehand, because once we get into that shadowy period of this 6 weeks between September 2nd and October 17th, you might be less clear about what that even is, about what you even want things to look like as you step through the portal. So it's good to think about it now. That's what we're here to do now on this podcast episode. And so right now, as I'm recording this, it's August 21st as I'm recording this. We are in Shravana, the month of Shravana. So this happens every year. The month of Shravana happens around this time. And so Shravana means like listening. Shravana means to hear, right? And so this period of the month of Shravana, August 5th to September 2nd this year, 2024, is basically a period to slow down and listen. So it's a time to slow down and pay attention. We also have Mercury retrograde right now, and you could revisit that episode as well. But Mercury retrograde bringing up all this stuff around ancestral trauma, lineage healing, nervous system stuff, which the nervous system is, if you've ever read about polyvagal theory, the nervous system is sort of that link between the psychosomatics that I was just talking about. So that stuff's coming up right now in August. So if you're paying a lot of attention, if you slow down and listen, which is basically that's an oversimplification, but that's basically what the month of Shravana is about, slowing down and listening. If you do that now, you will have a clearer picture of sort of what's coming up and what maybe patterns you are hoping to either ingrain deeper or not during this eclipse season, what patterns you might be hoping to change. And so that's leading up into, remember I said September 2nd with that new moon is the official beginning of eclipse season. So all the way from right now when you're listening to this through that new moon, which I will cover on its own episode, is a time to slow down and listen and be thinking about what patterns are coming up. And so you might revisit, especially the journal prompts from the Mercury retrograde episode, to maybe consider some of those things, what might be coming up. And then right on September 2nd, but September 6th through 17th is a 10-day celebration in the Hindu tradition to celebrate Ganesh's birthday. And Ganesh is the remover of obstacles. So basically, I'll say more. Let me just keep explaining the progression of these sacred periods and how it's aligning with eclipse season. So it's like leading up until eclipse season is Shravana. It's time to slow down and listen. And then in that period, the first 2 weeks before the first eclipse, that's part of eclipse season, but we haven't had an eclipse yet. It's time to think about removing obstacles and paying homage to Ganesh, right? The remover of obstacles. And then we have that time this year between eclipse seasons, between the eclipses, that Paksha, that 2 weeks, happens to also be Ancestor Fortnight, Pitru Paksha, which is a time that happens every year. And so Ancestor Fortnight happens at this time every year. And it's basically a time to integrate these karmic lessons and ancestral healing. Pay homage to your ancestors and maybe think about the sort of good that you got from your ancestors and what you want to carry on, and thanking them for getting you to where you are, but maybe also considering, because Rahu and Ketu also sort of represent karma in this way, right? Like the hand you've been dealt in life, the past life karma, which often comes from the ancestors, and then Rahu being your forward moving karma, like what you're going to do about it, what you're going to learn, and what karma you're going to undo, or maybe new karma you're going to gain in this lifetime. That's Rahu. And so Ancestor Fortnight happens every year around this time. And just based on where the nodes are, based on where Rahu and Ketu are, that's why these eclipses are perfectly aligning with Ancestor Fortnight. So that just means that during this eclipse season, the themes of this sort of ancestral healing and either ingraining the good things that you got from your ancestors and carrying on those traditions, or healing maybe the trauma that you got from them, is extra heightened at this eclipse time. And so right now, as I mentioned, with this Mercury retrograde bringing up a similar sort of lineage healing vibe while Shravana is going on, now is really a time to be listening to, that's why I said revisit those journal prompts from that Mercury retrograde episode. And then after the second eclipse after the second eclipse that's on October 2nd, that will lead us to our final, 2 weeks, final paksha of this period, is always right after Ancestor Fortnight. We have Navaratri, which is like the 9 nights of the goddess, a time to celebrate being renewed. So let me just recap that. These spiritual festivals that happen every year, it just happens to be that this year, because of where the nodes of the moon are, where Rahu and Ketu are, they're overlapping with eclipse season, which sounds bad. I think a lot of people, there's fear mongering out there about this. You basically just need to shut down and not live your life for the next 2 months for September and October because of all this crazy astrological stuff happening, that kind of points to slowing down and being more internal. I'll say more about how I think you should actually work with it when I get to the yoga practices and journal prompts in just a moment. But I just want to always be clear that I am trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to undo all of that fear mongering that I feel like people come to me with these internalized messages that gives them analysis paralysis, and they just end up not doing anything at all because they're scared to do the wrong thing. And that's what the great majority of students, especially around eclipse season, come to me with some baggage around, I guess. If you're not new to eclipse season. If you are new to eclipse season, then just hear me when I say you don't need to shut down and not live your life. So these sacred periods, just to recap, we're starting with Shravana, leading up to eclipse season, overlapping with this Mercury retrograde. It's a good time to slow down and listen, especially to the lineage healing or generational trauma stuff coming up for you. And revisit that Mercury retrograde episode if you want help sorting that out. What exactly should I be listening to? And then after that, we go into the Ganesh Chaturthi. So, and I'm sorry, I was avoiding saying that until now because I'm not even sure if I'm saying that right. It's one of those ones I've only seen written. So that is the time to pay homage to Ganesh, the remover of obstacles. So, what are the things getting in the way of you having these spiritual practices, or what are the sort of karmic blockages that you want to maybe ask Ganesh to remove during that time? And then following that is Ancestor Fortnight, which is right at the peak of the eclipses. Ancestor Fortnight begins at this first eclipse, the lunar eclipse in Pisces, and then it ends on the solar eclipse in Virgo. And so that will really be the time to pay attention to what sort of ancestral healing or karmic lessons are really coming through, and how you want to then, after that second eclipse and during Navaratri, how do you want to step forward renewed after that second eclipse? So that's sort of the greater context. There are a couple other things. I've already mentioned the Mercury retrograde leading up to the eclipse and how that's bringing up this sort of ancestral healing stuff, as much as Ancestor Fortnight happening right during the peak of eclipses is. And the other thing is that also sort of right during this time, Uranus is going retrograde on September 1st, which is, remember, that's the day before the new moon in Leo that marks the beginning of eclipse season. So the day before eclipse season starts, Uranus is going retrograde in Taurus. Uranus is there in Taurus with Jupiter, who is the ruler of Pisces, where the first eclipse is happening. So that's the connection. And Jupiter is going retrograde on October 9th in Taurus. And so I will, of course, cover that in its own special episode too. I will cover, if I'm saying this stuff and you're just like, what? Like, what? How did I put all these pieces together? Don't worry too much about the individual pieces right now. There are resources you can revisit on this podcast and on my website about each individual piece, especially if one sort of strikes a chord with you. But also know that I will be covering each individual eclipse. I'll be covering this stuff more as we go. Right now, I'm just trying to zoom out, and we're trying to see how all these individual little cogs, these little gears, are moving together, right? You can think of them as they're all interlinked, right? And so right now we're trying to see the big picture, and we'll zoom in on the individual pieces. So don't worry about the individual pieces too much right now. I'm just trying to kind of touch on all of them so that you can have that sort of zoomed out big picture view. And so with the Uranus and Jupiter retrogrades happening, you can revisit, I believe it was like the May outlook from this year, May 2024. It could have been June 2024. One of those outlooks. You'll find it in the show notes where I talked about both things. But basically, Uranus is like sudden events, upheaval, new solutions to old problems was like the key word for Uranus and Taurus. And it just moved there. It's the beginning of a 7-year cycle. Around the same time Jupiter moved there in like May of this year. I think Jupiter moved there in May and Uranus moved there in like June 1st. And so they're both going retrograde around the same time. And so it's connected to the eclipses in a big way because where the eclipses is happening is ruled by Jupiter. And that's, if that doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. Just know that it is connected. And basically, Taurus being an earth sign is also bringing up this connection to like the material reality and, like resources. With the Pisces and Virgo axis being activated in a big way, we're considering things like psychosomatics and how your spiritual and physical wellness are interconnected. And maybe what sort of karma or traumas you have that factor into that is a big theme of this eclipse season, and we'll parse it out as we go. But there's this also coming up is like, it's hard to address those things if you are not like financially stable. And that's what Uranus and Jupiter and Taurus are kind of pointing out, or maybe asking you to look at. And so you can think of it as like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, before you can start doing the self-actualizing and all this like spiritual, emotional sort of work, you have to be like physically healthy and, have your basic human needs taken care of. This is what I always tell people when they like fall asleep in restorative class or something. I'm like, if you fell asleep during Shavasana or like in a restorative pose, that just means you needed sleep more than you needed meditation, because meditation is self-care, right? And tapping into this spiritual work that I'm talking about. But if your, sleep needs aren't taken care of and you're falling asleep during meditation, then that just means you need to take care of your sleep needs. And then you can think about self-actualizing, or, that top of the hierarchy of needs, after the foundational stuff in the pyramid is taken care of. And that's coming up with the Uranus and Jupiter in Taurus thing. So let's recap and move into your yoga practices and journal prompts. So the overall energies are this maybe obsession sort of towards spiritual awakening, deep emotional healing, feeling really called towards those things. And if you are, then great. That's like what we're here to do. And then, also this sort of like realignment of values and priorities. So that's especially related to the Uranus and Jupiter in Taurus. Connection is like really like, what are your values, and are you living in alignment with them? And if you find that the answer is no, great, now you're aware. And these eclipses can help you maybe work through the emotional or subconscious blocks that are keeping you from the physical and like daily habit actions that it will take to live in alignment with those values, if that makes sense. So that's the kind of portal that we're talking about, is working through this, like maybe psychosomatic or, and so when I say psychosomatic, I feel like that has a connotation to it that's like, you're making it up, it's all in your head. No, psychosomatic symptoms are real. And they're real symptoms, but they're the kind of symptoms that you go to a doctor and they're like, well, there's no tissue damage, your blood work is coming back normal, your hormones are coming back normal, so you must be fine. There must be nothing wrong with you, right? It's all in your head. That's psychosomatic. But those physical symptoms are real, and they're just as debilitating as they would be if there were tissue damage or whatever, if your levels were out of whack. And also, the frustrating thing is that doctors will tell you you're fine, nothing's wrong with you, and it's all in your head, and that's how they'll treat you. And so it's kind of turning to these, spiritual, somatic practices that will help. And that's what the yoga practices and journal prompts are for. And that's the work that I do with yoga therapy as well, as that sort of somatic healing. And so, to recap, this eclipse season is a good time for spiritual practices and introspection. So doing that that gazing into the abyss, looking into your subconscious and getting curious about what's there and what's coming up and where this stuff is coming from, right? It's also a good time to connecting to your health routine, or how that is there a connection? Like if you do yoga, odds are your health routine is connected to spirituality, because that's kind of the vibe of yoga. But if not, now is a good time to connect the dots if they aren't connected. It's also a good time to focus on grounding and embodiment. So if you are just doing this sort of gazing into the abyss without connecting it to the body, this like where are these psychological or spiritual things landing in your physical body, that's sort of the connection between this Pisces and Virgo, the Rahu and Ketu. That's the connection we're hoping to draw. We don't want these two things to be separated, and that's what Rahu and Ketu are trying to do, is separate them. And we're trying to draw the integration. It's also a good time for cutting back to what really matters. So Virgo has a really big like minimalist vibe, and so with K2 there, it's even better to like minimize as much as you can. Focus on what's really important and be honest with yourself, because that Rahu and Pisces can bring somewhat of a delusional vibe. And so I'll leave it at that. Where have you been delusional? Where can you kind of like, and I hate to say it like that because I'm like, I don't know, I'm a Pisces rising, y'all. Like, I can be a little delulu myself. And so sometimes it's like, ouch, that stings to point out ways that I maybe have been being delusional. But this eclipse season is a good time to think about that. And so it's a bad time for sort of the opposite of the things I just said, especially being financially delusional, especially after Uranus goes retrograde in Taurus. And the Jupiter in Taurus can lead to a little bit of like an overspending vibe. So just be careful with that. It's also a bad time for being overly critical, because that's unfortunately a shadow side of Virgo vibes, is that Virgo can be a little bit critical, a little bit harsh, a little bit stinging with their words, or critical, perfectionist is maybe coming up. High expectations, letting perfect be the enemy of good. And that can be in terms of your own self, your own practices, your own work, but also in relationships. So Venus will be debilitated in Virgo at the time of these eclipses. So just have some care, especially when it comes to relationships around the eclipses, that you just soften your approach a little bit. And it's also because of that Venus thing I didn't mention until now, but just watch out for miscommunications or poor boundaries, or being overly sensitive, maybe knowing that other folks might also have this tendency to be a little bit extra critical or a little bit sharper with their words. And so your yoga practices for the whole period, of course, we'll dive into individual yoga practices for each eclipse itself. But basically the whole time, yin yoga and restorative yoga are highly, highly indicated for this kind of work, for this sort of like deep emotional release and the psychosomatic connection of like what's going on in your brain, where is that causing holding patterns in your body. Yin yoga and restorative yoga, they are different, but they both are very strong for sorting this kind of thing out. And then sort of purification type kriyas, if you know any. So Kapalabhati, skull shining breath, that's a good one. But also, if you don't know that one, like, don't try to go out and do it on YouTube. Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing. It's good around Virgo season anyway, around the change of seasons, around what we call the shoulder seasons. When we get around the equinoxes, spring and fall equinoxes, that sort of balancing between sun and moon, balancing between light and dark, balancing the sides of the body. It's also very, it's like clarifying for the brain. So Nadi Shodhana is always a good one. Alternate nostril breathing. So I'm actually not going to say your journal prompts out loud. I'm going to point you to that blog post because we are late in the episode. And that's a fun new thing about the blog post. If you go to yogiscopes.com, click on weekly Yogiscopes, it will be up by Friday, your eclipse season one, because there's a lot for this one. And I want y'all to get used to going there and seeing your sign by sign, reading the one for your rising and moon sign, because that's the fun thing about for eclipse season. I'll post it for everybody because this is a biggie. And so just to kind of recap, if you want to have my one-on-one attention support to the kind of things that we're working on for this eclipse season, like this deep emotional healing, the psychosomatic work, I am opening up 3 spots for readings, for eclipse season readings. And then after this, I'm not planning on offering one-off readings for the foreseeable future because I want to work with folks in a more longer-term container than just a one-off reading. Where for the whole container of eclipse season, for the whole portal from September 2nd to October 17th. So if you book now, we can have your reading before eclipse season starts. And then you can have the focus and flow sessions, unlimited 15-minute follow-up sessions with me for that time to help you like get into focus and flow, right? Because like I was saying, the eclipse season can kind of muddy the awareness. And so you'll have my support to integrate the things that we come up with in your birth chart reading. So we'll start out with that 1-hour birth chart reading with a special focus on the things that might be coming up for you specifically based on your chart for this eclipse season. So we'll start with that, but you also get 6 weeks of the focus and flow sessions. So maybe you've heard me talking about that. If not, you can now go see both things on, when you go to yogiscopes.com, click offerings, and you'll see this special eclipse season reading. Once all 3 spots are gone, there will be no more readings for they'll only come as parts of either yoga therapy packages or focus and flow sessions, because I just don't see a lot of value personally for you or for me in us just having this 1 hour together, talking about all this deep stuff and then never seeing each other again. I feel like that's a waste of my yoga therapy skills, honestly, because it's one thing to know all of the karmas that are coming up or showing up in your birth chart, and it's another thing to actually put changes into practice. And so that's what the yoga therapy or the focus and flow sessions are designed to do, is like, okay, now you know all these things, but what are you going to do about it? And you can have my support in that way. It's a really beautiful container. It's really transformative to say, like, we're going to work on one little bite-sized thing at a time. You're going to implement it like maybe once. It might be a journal prompt. It might be a conversation. It might be a, like, you need to decide this thing, you need to go do a meditation, whatever. It could be like anything under the sun that will get you closer to what your goals are, and then report back. You could report back later the same day if you do the thing that we talk about, or it could be the next day, or some folks fall into a sort of once or twice a week rhythm. It's really up to you and what you're working with and what you have bandwidth for. That's the idea. So I wish you all the best for eclipse season, and yeah, I look forward to working more in a one-on-one container going forward. That's what I would rather do. But as always, if you want, a group container, you can now join the Vedic Astrology Club. You'll see it on the weekly Yogiscopes. So I wish you the best. Please remember to keep your feet on the ground, your head in the stars, and stay in the light. Until next time, take great care of yourself.